Today, I want to talk to you about something that intersects deeply with how your brain and body function, and more importantly, how you can use that understanding to radically shift your trajectory. It's a concept rooted in neuroscience, psychology, and behavioral change, and it starts with this truth: you can force yourself to reset your life. Now, when I say force, I don't mean in a reckless, impulsive way. I mean applying deliberate, structured pressure to override old patterns, neurological loops that keep you stuck in behaviors, mindsets and emotional responses that no longer serve you. Your brain is plastic, it's adaptable. But change doesn't happen passively. It happens when you interrupt the loop. The human brain loves homeostasis. It loves predictability even when that predictability is toxic. But the moment you introduce a conscious, repeated pattern that's inconsistent with your old identity, your nervous system starts to update its model of who you are. And that's where real transformation begins, not with motivation, not with emotion, but with intervention. This talk is about how to use your physiology, your breath, your focus, your routines to interrupt the feedback loop of your current life and lay down new neural pathways that reflect who you intend to become. If you're stuck, burned out, or feel like you're living someone else's script, this is not a motivational speech. This is a call to action that's biologically grounded and behaviorally tested. Discomfort is one of the most misunderstood sensations in the human experience. Most people interpret it as a cue to stop, to retreat, or to avoid whatever is triggering that feeling. But from a neurobiological perspective, discomfort is not the enemy. It's actually a highly precise signal that your nervous system is adapting, stretching, and moving into unfamiliar but potentially valuable territory. When we begin to feel psychological or physical discomfort, what's really happening is a cascade of stress hormones and neural signals telling the body that it is operating outside of homeostasis. The brain is designed to preserve energy and resist unpredictability. So when we do something unfamiliar, waking up earlier, changing a routine, starting a new habit, the brain initially pushes back. This pushback is not a signal to stop, but an indication that we are stepping into the zone of plasticity, the very zone required to rewire our behavior and identity. At the core of this idea is the concept of neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to change and rewire itself through experience. Neuroplasticity doesn't occur when we are relaxed and passive. It is most heightened when we are focused and engaged, especially in moments of challenge or strain. When we lean into discomfort, whether that's emotional, cognitive, or physical, we are actually signaling to the brain that it needs to make adjustments. These adjustments are how new habits are formed, how new identities are built, and how old self-sabotaging loops are interrupted. Most people wait for motivation to strike before they act, but the real mechanism for transformation lies in pushing through the threshold of resistance and entering a space where effort is required and comfort is temporarily unavailable. Stress, in manageable doses, is actually a biochemical invitation to grow. Acute stress activates the sympathetic nervous system, preparing the body for action, sharpening focus, and enhancing memory encoding. In evolutionary terms, discomfort meant danger or challenge, which meant the organism needed to pay close attention. In modern terms, the same mechanism can be leveraged for growth. When you feel resistance before a workout, anxiety before a conversation, or overwhelm before starting a new habit, that's the same circuit that once helped our ancestors survive. But instead of fleeing from discomfort, the opportunity now is to sit in it, lean into it, and use it as a portal to rewire your internal operating system. What makes this especially powerful is that leaning into discomfort doesn't need to be extreme. Even small, deliberate exposures to discomfort, like taking a cold shower, fasting for a short time, or introducing difficult conversations, can begin the process of training your nervous system to tolerate stress. This is known as stress inoculation, and it's used in everything from elite military training to cognitive behavioral therapy. The nervous system becomes more resilient not by avoiding stress, but by being gradually exposed to it in a controlled and intentional way. Each time you step into discomfort willingly, you increase your threshold for challenge, making future efforts feel more manageable. Your brain and body remember the previous stressor, and they adapt accordingly. This is also why rituals and routines matter. When you consistently push through resistance, even in small doses, you begin to shift the internal narrative from "I can't" to "I do hard things regularly." This reframe is not psychological fluff. It's anchored in real changes to brain structure and chemistry. Cortical networks responsible for decision-making, focus, and emotional regulation begin to strengthen, especially the prefrontal cortex, which governs executive function. Over time, your tolerance for discomfort becomes your superpower. What once triggered avoidance now becomes familiar. And what was once anxiety becomes activation, a readiness signal for growth. One of the biggest mistakes people make when trying to reset their life is interpreting discomfort as failure. They assume that if something feels hard or unnatural, it must be wrong. But in truth, that's exactly the point where change begins. The discomfort is the doorway. Your physiology is simply adjusting to a new load. Just like muscles tear and rebuild under strain, your mental and emotional systems need friction to restructure themselves. Without that friction, there's no growth, no learning, no evolution. You stay in the loop. You stay the same. The people who make radical changes in life aren't always the most disciplined or the most intelligent. They are simply the most willing to engage with the discomfort and persist through it. The more often you confront discomfort voluntarily, the more familiar it becomes. What was once unbearable becomes tolerable. What was once tolerable becomes a signal of growth. And with repetition, you start to create a feedback loop where discomfort and progress become linked. The nervous system, now conditioned to see stress as a useful input, begins to respond with less fear and more readiness. Cortisol spikes less sharply. Heart rate variability improves. You recover faster. The stress response becomes calibrated instead of chaotic. This biological tuning gives you more control, more capacity, and more choice in moments of challenge. The idea that your brain rewires through repetition and deliberate action, not motivation, is rooted in the fundamental science of how neural circuits are formed and modified. Motivation is fleeting. It's a transient state driven by fluctuating neurochemical signals like dopamine. While it can initiate a behavior occasionally, it's unreliable for sustaining long-term change. The brain doesn't wait for motivation to build habits or identity. It responds to patterns. What you do repeatedly, especially under conditions of focused attention, is what gets encoded into the structure of your brain. Neuroplasticity, the capacity for the brain to change its wiring and function, operates through a principle known as Hebbian learning, often summarized as neurons that fire together wire together. What this means is that repeated activation of certain neural circuits strengthens those circuits over time. But for this process to take place, the brain needs repeated exposure to the new behavior or thought pattern. One isolated act won't do it. Occasional bursts of effort inspired by emotion won't do it either. It's the consistency, the deliberate repetition, that leads to long-term wiring changes. This also explains why people can read books, attend seminars, or have powerful insights, yet still return to the same habits. Insight is valuable, but it doesn't produce change unless it is followed by action. And that action must be repeated often enough for the brain to recognize it as a new default. The basal ganglia, a region of the brain responsible for habit formation, responds to repeated behavior, not emotional spikes. Every time you take the same action, wake up early, go to the gym, eat a certain way, speak up in a meeting, you're sending a message to your brain, this is who I am now. And with enough repetition, that message gets encoded. Deliberate action is key here. Mindless repetition doesn't have the same effect. The more attention and effort you bring to a new behavior, the more likely your brain is to mark that activity as important. This is because the neuromodulator acetylcholine is released during periods of focused attention, sharpening the brain's ability to form new connections. It acts like a spotlight, telling the nervous system this moment matters. Pay attention here. Without that deliberate engagement, behavior tends to remain shallow and the neural changes don't take root. Another critical factor is the timing of your actions. Early in the process of behavior change, the brain is more malleable. The circuits are not yet fixed, so there's more opportunity to redirect them. This is where people often get confused. They think they need to feel motivated for the first few days or weeks to build momentum. But motivation usually fades fast. What you actually need is structure, a system for taking the same action at the same time, regardless of mood. This consistency trains the brain to anticipate the action, making it feel more natural over time. This process is measurable at the level of brain chemistry. Repetition alters the density and efficiency of synaptic connections. It leads to long-term potentiation, a lasting increase in signal transmission between neurons. This is not a theoretical idea, it's a biological reality that explains why new habits become easier the more often you do them. Initially, the new behavior feels hard because your brain is using unfamiliar circuits. But with repetition, those circuits become more efficient and the behavior becomes automatic. Many people wait for clarity or confidence before they act. But in neuroscience, confidence is not a prerequisite for action, it is a consequence of it. Each time you act deliberately, even without motivation, you send a signal to your nervous system that you are capable of doing hard things. This builds what's known as self-efficacy, the belief in your ability to exert control over your behavior and environment. Self-efficacy is one of the strongest predictors of long-term change, and it is built through doing, not thinking. This process also taps into the brain's reward system. When you complete a task, especially one that required effort or discomfort, you get a small hit of dopamine not from the outcome, but from the recognition of your effort. Over time, your brain starts to associate the process itself with reward. This shift from craving the result to enjoying the ritual is what separates those who sustain change from those who don't. They don't wait to feel good to start, they start and feeling good comes from the repetition. Even the resistance you feel when beginning a new behavior is part of the rewiring process. That resistance is the old neural circuitry pushing back. It's a signal that you're disrupting an established pattern. Rather than interpreting it as a stop sign, understand it as evidence that your brain is noticing the change. The friction is neurological feedback. And each time you act anyway, despite the friction, the new pattern gets stronger. This is why change is rarely dramatic at first. It's subtle. It accumulates, one deliberate repetition layered on top of another, day after day. There's no single defining moment that resets your life. It's the cumulative impact of thousands of small, intentional acts. And each act is an opportunity to reinforce a new identity, a new standard, a new baseline of who you are. The autonomic nervous system is the system that controls your internal state, how alert or relaxed you feel, how much energy you can access, and how your body prepares for action or rest. Most people think of change as something that starts with the mind, with thoughts or decisions, but in reality, the mind follows the body. If your body is in a reactive, anxious, or fatigued state, it becomes extremely difficult to think clearly, stay disciplined, or commit to new habits. That's because your internal physiological state acts as the foundation for everything else you try to build on top of it. To reset your life, you must first reset your state. This is not a mindset shift, it's a nervous system shift. Your autonomic nervous system has two primary branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic system is responsible for mobilizing you for action. It's what gets activated when you feel stress or urgency. The parasympathetic system is responsible for rest, digestion, and recovery. A healthy reset in life requires learning how to consciously navigate between these two states. It's not about avoiding stress or being perpetually calm. It's about developing the skill to regulate yourself on demand, using tools that directly influence your internal physiology. One of the fastest and most reliable ways to change your internal state is through your breath. Breathing is unique in that it's both automatic and controllable. That means you can use it as a manual override to shift how your brain and body are functioning. Shallow, rapid breaths tend to signal to the brain that you are in danger, keeping you in a high alert sympathetic state. Slow, deep breathing, particularly emphasizing the exhale, sends a signal to your parasympathetic system that it's safe to relax. This change is measurable, heart rate slows, cortisol levels drop, blood flow to the prefrontal cortex increases, allowing for better decision-making and emotional control. You are not just calming down, you are gaining access to the part of your brain responsible for long-term planning and intentional behavior. Visual focus is another tool for nervous system regulation. When you're stressed or overwhelmed, your visual field tends to narrow. This is called tunnel vision, and it's a direct reflection of your internal state. You can reverse this by expanding your gaze literally. Looking at the horizon or allowing your eyes to go into panoramic vision tells the brain that you are not in immediate danger. This changes the ratio of sympathetic to parasympathetic activity in the body, creating a shift from reactivity to control. Again, you're not calming yourself with thoughts, you're adjusting your physiology with sensory input. Movement is another entry point. When you move your body deliberately, especially through rhythmic activities like walking, jogging, or even cycling, you engage circuits in the brainstem that regulate arousal and balance. This is not just about burning calories, it's about moving energy through the system in a way that supports nervous system balance. Movement during moments of emotional or mental overload can reset the entire system, not just emotionally, but physiologically. It brings coherence between the brain and body, which then allows for clarity in decision-making. Light exposure also plays a key role in nervous system state. Viewing natural sunlight in the first 30 to 60 minutes after waking has a direct effect on your circadian rhythm, cortisol production, and dopamine levels. This input from light is one of the strongest anchors for your internal clock, which regulates everything from sleep quality to hormonal cycles. When people feel stuck or unmotivated, it is often not a lack of willpower, it's a disrupted circadian rhythm. Without proper light exposure and alignment of sleep-wake cycles, your baseline nervous system state becomes erratic, making it nearly impossible to sustain new habits or behaviors. Temperature can also influence your internal state. Deliberate exposure to cold, such as cold showers or ice baths, activates the sympathetic nervous system in a controlled manner. This brief, intentional stressor raises norepinephrine levels, increases alertness, and sharpens focus. When used properly, cold exposure trains your nervous system to handle stress without panic. You become familiar with the sensations of discomfort while staying calm and in control. This builds resilience not just physically but mentally because you're practicing the art of staying present and regulated in the face of challenge. The goal is not to eliminate stress, but to gain agency over your internal state so that stress does not dictate your actions. Most people are walking around in a dysregulated state without realizing it, fatigued but wired, anxious but unfocused, busy but ineffective. Resetting your life requires resetting the baseline of your nervous system. That baseline is what determines whether you procrastinate or take action, whether you respond with discipline or distraction, whether you stay stuck or move forward. If your baseline state is reactive, even the best ideas and intentions will collapse under pressure. If your baseline state is regulated and grounded, you create space for those intentions to take root and become consistent actions. This is where sustainable change begins, not with motivational content, but with the biology of calm focus and physiological readiness. Identity is not a fixed trait you are born with. It is a construct built through behavior. Your sense of self, how you view your capabilities, habits, and character is shaped by what you do consistently over time. The brain does not build identity from abstract beliefs alone. Instead, it observes your repeated actions and infers identity from them. This means that if you want to shift your identity, you must first shift your behavior. And that shift must be forced at the beginning because your current identity is defended by neurological and psychological patterns that resist change. Forcing a behavioral shift interrupts these patterns, creating a window of opportunity to lay down new ones. The brain is constantly monitoring your behavior through a process known as self-signaling. Every time you take an action, especially under pressure or in moments of resistance, you send a signal to your own nervous system. This is what I do. This is who I am. These signals accumulate and eventually form what we call identity. It is not formed through affirmations, visualization, or thinking about change. It is formed through action repeated, consistent, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable, because discomfort marks the boundary between your current identity and the one you're trying to build. Pushing through that boundary is what initiates the transformation process. Behavior shapes neural pathways. Every time you make a decision to act in alignment with a new version of yourself, you are reinforcing circuits in your brain. Over time, these circuits become more efficient, making the behavior feel more natural, more automatic. This is how identity becomes embodied. It moves from being something you aspire to into something you do without thinking. But this process doesn't begin automatically. It has to be initiated deliberately, even forcibly, because the brain defaults to patterns that feel familiar, even when those patterns are limiting or destructive. Change always feels unnatural at first, not because it's wrong, but because it is unfamiliar to the nervous system. This is why intention alone is never enough. You can intend to wake up early, exercise, be more focused, stop procrastinating, but none of that reshapes identity unless the intention is converted into repeated behavior. The repeated behavior doesn't just produce external results, it rewires internal self-perception. The more you behave like the person you want to become, the more evidence your brain gathers to support that new identity. Eventually, it shifts the baseline of how you see yourself, which in turn influences what behaviors feel congruent or incongruent with that identity. Identity becomes the filter through which decisions are made, and that filter was built by action. The process of forcing a behavioral shift requires friction. You're disrupting what the brain perceives as normal. This creates internal resistance, often experienced as hesitation, doubt, or discomfort. But that friction is not a problem, it is the sign that you are reprogramming the system. You are removing one behavioral loop and replacing it with another. The prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for intentional behavior, becomes more active when you're doing something that contradicts your current habits. This activity must be repeated for the new pattern to become stable. The more you repeat the behavior, the less cognitive effort it takes, and the more automatic it becomes. At that point, your brain has encoded the new behavior as part of your identity. There is also a biochemical component to this process. Each time you act in alignment with a new identity, particularly when it's difficult, your brain releases dopamine not from the result, but from the act of overcoming resistance. This dopamine reinforces the neural circuitry involved in that behavior. Over time, you begin to associate effort with reward, which is the opposite of how most people are conditioned. Most people seek comfort and ease, believing that effort is something to avoid. But if you learn to associate effort with identity transformation, then every difficult action becomes fuel for a stronger, more resilient version of yourself. This entire process is not about being perfect, it's about being deliberate. You can miss a day, fail at a task, or feel resistance, but as long as you return to the behavior consistently, your brain will keep adapting. The system is designed to respond to what you do most often, not what you do occasionally. If you want to become someone new, you don't need to wait for clarity, confidence, or motivation. You need to decide what actions that version of you would take and begin taking them now. Your identity doesn't change when you feel different. It changes when you act different. Behavior precedes belief. Action precedes transformation. You don't think your way into a new life, you behave your way into one. And each small, deliberate shift in behavior is a step toward a fundamentally new internal operating system, one that eventually replaces the old without asking for permission. When it comes to creating meaningful and lasting change, one of the most underestimated and underutilized strategies is the deliberate use of friction. Most people view friction, obstacles, discomfort, inconvenience as something negative, something to be eliminated. But in reality, friction is one of the most powerful tools for shaping behavior and resetting your life. Friction acts as both a disruptor of unhealthy patterns and a catalyst for discipline. When used strategically, it forces your nervous system out of autopilot and into deliberate, conscious effort. That shift is what makes change not just possible, but permanent. Friction interrupts the path of least resistance. The brain loves efficiency, and it will always default to behaviors that are familiar, easy, and immediately rewarding. That's how habits, good or bad, get formed. They are repeated enough times that the brain encodes them into low-resistance loops. So when you try to make a change, you're not just battling a behavior, you're battling the neural efficiency that makes the old behavior automatic. This is where friction becomes your ally. By increasing friction around negative behaviors and reducing friction around positive ones, you can change the default settings of your life. For example, if you want to stop checking your phone the moment you wake up, you create friction by placing it across the room. If you want to start journaling in the morning, you remove friction by putting your journal on your pillow before you sleep. These small physical adjustments create a different behavioral landscape. You're not just using willpower, you're altering the environment in a way that speaks directly to your nervous system. The nervous system doesn't respond to your goals or intentions, it responds to what is easy to access and what is difficult to engage in. When you reverse that equation intentionally, behavior begins to shift. Friction also builds resilience. The human brain and body adapt to stress through a process called hormesis, where small amounts of stress improve the system's ability to handle future stress. Introducing friction deliberately, whether it's through cold exposure, fasting, physical training, or structured discipline, increases your tolerance for discomfort. That tolerance is crucial because every meaningful change involves moments of resistance. If you're trained to avoid those moments, you'll never push through the discomfort long enough to create new habits. But if you learn to lean into friction, to see it as a sign that change is occurring, you rewire your relationship with challenge itself. There is also a chemical shift that happens when you voluntarily face friction. Dopamine, the molecule of motivation, is not just released when you achieve something, it's also released when you pursue something difficult, especially when that pursuit is self-initiated. This is how the brain begins to associate effort with reward. The pursuit itself becomes meaningful. This changes everything because it turns the daily process of struggle into something that reinforces itself neurologically. Instead of waiting for success to feel good, you begin to derive meaning and satisfaction from the effort itself. Another advantage of friction is that it exposes unconscious behavior. Most of what people do every day is automated. They're not thinking about it. They're repeating patterns. When you introduce friction into a behavior such as requiring an extra step to access a bad habit or making a healthy habit easier to begin, you interrupt the unconscious cycle. Suddenly, you have to make a decision. That decision-making moment is where awareness returns, and with awareness comes the power to redirect. You are no longer trapped in the loop. You are now actively engaging with your actions. That engagement is where change happens. Strategic friction also strengthens the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for executive function, long-term planning, and self-control. Every time you override a reflexive behavior in favor of a more intentional one, you activate and strengthen these neural circuits. It's not about being perfect. It's about practicing the skill of choosing the harder path when it leads to something better. That skill accumulates over time, turning moments of friction into milestones of transformation. You no longer see discipline as something forced, you see it as the architecture of freedom. Because discipline created through friction doesn't just make you more productive, it gives you sovereignty over your impulses. Most people live their lives avoiding friction, seeking comfort and convenience at every turn. But comfort, when pursued mindlessly, becomes a trap. It dulls your instincts, weakens your mental muscles, and conditions your nervous system to expect ease. When life inevitably presents real difficulty, untrained systems break down. But if you've trained in friction, if you've deliberately made your life harder in small, controlled ways, you are ready. You are resilient. You are not shocked by discomfort, you are familiar with it. You've used it as a training ground to sculpt your focus, your habits, your standards. And that preparation is what allows you to rise when others retreat, to stay clear-headed when others panic, to continue forward when everything in you wants to stop. Your environment is the invisible hand that shapes your behavior. While most people try to change their lives by focusing only on internal factors, motivation, mindset, willpower, they overlook the external structures that are constantly influencing them. The cues, patterns, people, and systems that surround you create the conditions in which your nervous system either thrives or deteriorates. You cannot out-discipline a destructive environment. Even the strongest mindset will bend under the weight of constant triggers that pull you back into old patterns. If you want to reset your life, you have to reset the architecture around you. Your brain is a prediction machine. It looks for signals from the environment to determine what to expect and how to respond. When you walk into your bedroom and see your phone, your brain remembers the loop: pick it up, scroll, disconnect. When you sit in a cluttered workspace, your nervous system responds with distraction, stress, and fatigue. These responses are not random, they are conditioned by repetition. You have trained your brain to respond to your surroundings in a certain way. That means to create a new set of behaviors, you need to train your brain with a new set of cues. This is how environment becomes a form of behavioral design. One of the most powerful ways to use environment as a reset tool is through the principle of cue association. When you associate a space with a specific behavior, such as writing at a particular desk, meditating in a certain corner, exercising in a designated area, you reinforce neural circuits tied to that behavior. Over time, entering that environment becomes a trigger for the action itself. This is called context-dependent memory, and it's why behaviors become easier or harder depending on where you are. Instead of fighting your environment, you can engineer it to support the identity you're trying to build. Eliminating triggers is just as important as adding cues. If your goal is to reduce procrastination, but your environment is filled with instant gratification options, TV, social media, notifications, then your nervous system will default to those faster rewards. The dopaminergic system in the brain is highly sensitive to environmental stimuli. Every time you see a notification badge or hear a ping, your brain gets a hit of dopamine, reinforcing distraction as a habit loop. Removing those triggers, silencing devices, deleting apps, physically separating yourself from tempting tools reduces the friction between you and the actions that actually align with your goals. Environment is not just physical, it's also relational. The people you surround yourself with have a direct impact on your internal state and behavioral norms. The brain uses a system called mirror neurons to simulate the experiences and behaviors of others. If you're surrounded by people who constantly complain, settle for less, or reinforce limiting beliefs, your nervous system adapts to that energy. On the other hand, if you're in a space where discipline, growth, and high standards are normalized, you will adapt upward. Your nervous system attunes to the group's rhythm, pace, and standards. You become what your environment expects of you, so choose environments that expect more. Light, noise, temperature, and structure are all environmental variables that influence your mental and emotional baseline. Poor lighting leads to disrupted circadian rhythms, which alters sleep quality and mood regulation. Noise pollution elevates stress hormones. Temperature extremes, if not deliberate, create discomfort that drains energy. Even the layout of your space, how easy it is to access tools, how cluttered or clean it feels, affects decision fatigue and cognitive clarity. Changing your environment doesn't require luxury or perfection, it requires intentionality. Small adjustments compound into massive shifts in how your nervous system operates day to day. Another powerful layer of environmental reset is behavioral priming. This involves preloading your environment with reminders or tools that align with the future version of yourself you're trying to build. That could mean putting your journal on your desk the night before, setting your workout clothes by the bed, leaving a book on the table instead of a remote control. These cues reduce friction and signal your brain, this is what we do here. Over time, the environment becomes a silent coach, nudging you, guiding you, pushing you toward alignment even when motivation is low. Environmental reset also includes the concept of ritual space. When you reserve certain places or times for specific activities, your brain learns to switch modes more efficiently. For example, if you only use your desk for focused work, your nervous system begins to associate that space with cognitive clarity. The same goes for rest. If your bed becomes a place only for sleep, not for scrolling, working, or eating, your body will fall asleep faster and rest more deeply. These associations create invisible boundaries between modes of behavior, helping you stay mentally organized and emotionally grounded. Environmental design becomes the scaffolding for discipline. It gives structure to your habits and stability to your nervous system. Rather than relying on emotional energy to force behavior, you create a setting where the desired behavior is the most obvious and accessible choice. The nervous system loves predictability. When your environment is designed with intention, that predictability works in your favor. You wake up already positioned for progress. You move through your day with fewer decision points and more momentum. You don't just change what you do, you change what feels natural to do. And that shift, when repeated across days and weeks, becomes the foundation of a completely new lifestyle and internal identity.